I'm Sarah Lebner from Cooee Architecture. I specialise in regional, energy-efficient, low-carbon homes that are an absolute joy to live in, and this channel is about sharing some of that knowledge with you. This series is all about my own farmhouse build, the Cooee House. Hello everyone, welcome to episode 1, all sharing the process and decisions on the Cooee build, and this episode is going to be talking about siting a project on a rural job. Something you probably don't have to think about much in an urban block, but when you've got a whole farm, deciding where you're going to go, it's quite tricky. There's probably 5 key priorities that you're looking to consider. So access being a really big one. Then you're looking at power and you're looking at water as well. And then probably views aspect as well as solar access, so how you're oriented. And then for us, a really big one was bushfire, but you might be in other sites where you're looking at flood. You also might be looking at microclimate, wind, privacy, all of those more obvious things. But those first 5 were the really big ones for us. So I wanted to explain why we chose this site here on our property. A really big one for us was views. We are very, very lucky to live in a part of the world where you can see the snowy mountains over my shoulder here. They don't look that significant in summer, but my gosh, in winter, waking up to see those just meant a whole lot to me, and was a really big priority. And we've had to invest more in some of those other aspects like access and power to get to this site. There's only a few spots around the farm where you can see those mountains, and we can also see the Murray River, which is really important to me as well. So we narrowed it down to areas where you could see that view. And there are a few sites around the farm. So then we were probably looking at slope and solar access. So even though it looks like there's a pretty big slope here, you can see we've been cutting in. Compared to the rest of the farm, it's fairly flat. And the other areas that you can see the mountains didn't have very nice northern aspects. So if I spin around here, there's a nice little remnant bushland, northern access and up the valley. And because we're doing a solar passive home, even though we're focusing on those southern views and want to see those, we also want to have a nice northern aspect, because we'll have a lot of glazing on the north side to invite in the winter sun. And probably a third big factor that was important to me, and I think a lot of farmers will understand this, was I wanted to be able to see a lot of our property and feel like we were fairly central in our property, because that's your home, it's your area, it's the sort of space that you were the guardian of. And I've spoken to a lot of farmers about this. If you pick a site where you're looking over the neighbours, or there was an opportunity to sort of see a lot of your property, but you've blocked that off, it doesn't really feel right, I guess. So I feel really comfortable in this site, and those were the big priorities. So let me show you through then what we had to deal with to get those other things working. I'll switch around to the plan here to show you. So here we are for site context. So this is our farm block, and this is my parents' house on the existing block, and we're over here. So we're a fair way from the road, so access and power, also a big consideration there. In terms of water, there is a spring here which we could tap into. We're choosing in the first instance to run on tank water, but we know that down the track, if that's ever not ample, we can tap into that. And you can also see here right from the get-go, I had those 2 views, so that river view and the snowy mountains view. Thinking about that, then we've got our nice northern north is up here, we can see on the survey, our northern orientation up sort of our valley and our property, and we're tilted slightly to the east, which both suits this view, but also slightly east of north is sort of your optimal solar passive design. So if I zoom down here, here's where you can see what that road looks like, and there's a pretty big gully crossing down through a creek here. So yes, it was a really considerable investment to get out to this site. But the double reasoning here is that this crossing has always been a bit problematic for our property. It's the only way to get across to the other half of our property without going right around through the neighbouring block that we lease. So investing in this also made sense from a farm point of view. It wasn't a complete vanity exercise. So what about power? I mean, it's always ideal to be grid connected if you are right next to the road, because then even if you're putting in solar, you can sort of work in tandem with the grid. I know feed-in tariffs aren't much these days, but it is the more sustainable thing to do so that you can pass on your excess. But as soon as you're getting further away from a property, these days it is quite possible to go off-grid. We will be off-grid with a pretty big system here, and if you're tossing up between the two, getting a quote for a transformer is a really important part to help you weigh that up as well. The final big factor for us here is pretty obviously bushfire, and there'll probably be a whole another episode talking about that. But if I show you briefly the plan thinking about that. So we have a full bushfire plan here. We're building to Bell 29, but just to show you some of the siting, that's been thinking about distances from risk areas. This lovely little remnant gully here is our biggest risk area, but also thinking about our asset protection zone where we're driving around, where we can access around and have water points. We'll have our firefighting on the tank here. And the other factor that some people will clue onto here is we do only have that single access road. Now the sort of default ruling around a bushfire block of this rating is that you would need 2 roads for access and egress, emergency exit. But we had a level 3 BPAD bushfire consultant in, and they have the capability to put forward a alternate proposal in that sense that then you can put towards your local council and your local fire service to consider. Ours was passed, and the main logic behind it was that we are building to a level above the bushfire TAC level rating that would have been stipulated. So therefore it is deemed to be safe to shelter in place at the property if a fire front happens to be blocking that road and there are services helping us or we can't escape. So it is nice to know that there's a little bit of logic and common sense that you can put forward in an alternate proposal on those things if you have the right professionals involved. Bushfire consultant was certainly one of the earliest consultants I had involved out here because I knew we would want to brainstorm that a bit. Now once you've got a site in mind, the absolute first thing you need to do is jump on whatever the planning council mapping for your state or territory is, and check in on some planning rules. So a really big one that you often get caught out in a rural area is what zone is your site and what is the minimum block size for you to put a residence on there. Now I did mention my parents' house is over here. It's on the same block that we are on. So we actually had to do a secondary residence, so that's sort of a different approach, and that means we had to go through a development application pathway to do that. We would have had to do a development application anyway because of our bushfire requirements as well. If you're building, you can sort of meet a heap of all the default things and sometimes go through a complying development pathway, and that means that you don't have to do the big formal development application with council and you sort of just skip to the it's called a building approval or a building permit or a construction certificate depending on what state or territory you're in, but that's just where they're really checking the actual regulatory construction to the Australian building code standards, and then your certifier or the council will also just do a check and say yep, they meet all the planning rules, so they didn't have to do a development application. So we've already got our development application here, which was a big relief for me because you're ticking off some of those things where you might be pushing the boundaries a little bit, such as with the bushfire and access, or seeking a secondary residence. We're very lucky in our council that they don't really care about the proximity of the secondary residence or the size, whereas other councils might have rules around that. So once you've done that preliminary planning check on your block, which is a bit hard to navigate without a professional, it's always a great idea, and even I do this still, is to call council once I think I have my head around it and just check in with them, ask to speak to a planning officer and say, hey, we're thinking of doing a project here. Our understanding is that we're in a bushfire overlay. Can we do a complying development here? Would a development application be required? And you might have other overlays come up, things like flood, high value agricultural land, heritage items, all of those things can come up as issues. So always check in with council before getting too invested in a location. The final question on this crash course on siting a rural job might be, at what point should you get a professional involved, architect or building designer? And my answer is probably as soon as possible. I've done plenty of jobs where we have driven around and looked at certain sites, but also if you can have done a lot of that thinking and groundwork beforehand, and perhaps have either a general area and then we can help you site within that, or maybe 2 or 3 key areas to help us narrow down the decision process. That's really good. But generally, if you're working with someone who offers that service, as I would prefer to do, that's exactly what we do. I come out and help people navigate all of the wants in relation to all of the sort of planning and siting requirements, as well as the practicalities. So as soon as possible. And in terms of the other consultants as well, often we're getting the bushfire consultant out straight away, maybe even before we've surveyed as well in this instance, and there might be other consultants that would be relevant to your job that you would do the same, engage them really early before committing too far down a path. Next episode, I reckon, might be showing you guys a bit of the plan and layout and how that came together. So hope you enjoyed this quick one. Please leave some comments down the bottom of things you'd like me to cover in this process. Really an open book, and looking forward to sharing as much as possible. Please like, share and subscribe. Thank you.